The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Oslo courthouse cast long shadows across courtroom 12. Captain Astrid Haugen sat perfectly still at the defendant's table, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Beside her, a magnificent Siberian Husky named Bjørn lay in perfect position, his ice-blue eyes alert but calm. To the packed gallery, Astrid appeared unremarkable. A woman in her early 40s, wearing a simple grey wool sweater and dark trousers. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her pale blue eyes held a distant quality, as if she were seeing something far beyond the courtroom walls. But those who looked closer might have noticed certain details. The way she held herself with military precision despite her civilian clothes. The small scar that ran from her left temple into her hairline. The weathered condition of her hands, marked by countless hours gripping helicopter controls in sub-zero temperatures. Judge Erik Nilsen called the court to order with visible impatience. A veteran of the Norwegian legal system, he had seen countless cases involving military personnel, but this one struck him as particularly frivolous. The defendant stands accused of multiple violations of restricted airspace over Svalbard archipelago, he announced, his voice echoing in the formal chamber. Unauthorized entry into military zones, failure to respond to air traffic control directives, and operation of aircraft in violation of NATO security protocols. Prosecutor Lars Andersen rose from his table, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. An ambitious young lawyer with political aspirations, he had taken this case expecting an easy victory against what appeared to be a delusional civilian pilot. Your Honor, Andersen began with theatrical confidence, the state will prove that Ms. Haugen has repeatedly violated Norwegian airspace restrictions, claiming to conduct emergency rescue operations that no legitimate authority has sanctioned or even acknowledged. He gestured dismissively toward Astrid, who remained motionless except for one hand that rested lightly on Bjørn's thick fur. The defendant claims to have rescued dozens of military personnel from crashed aircraft, performed impossible evacuations in Arctic storms, and operated under classified orders that conveniently cannot be verified. These are the fantasies of someone seeking attention and perhaps financial compensation through false heroic claims. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Several spectators shook their heads sympathetically, viewing Astrid as another veteran struggling with delusions of grandeur. Astrid's court-appointed attorney, Maria Olsen, looked distinctly uncomfortable. A dedicated public defender overwhelmed by her caseload, she had found no evidence to support her client's extraordinary claims. Military records showed only basic pilot training, with no mention of special operations or Arctic rescue missions. Your Honor, Maria said as she stood, my client maintains that her actions were authorized under NATO Article 5 emergency protocols, but the classified nature of these operations prevents us from presenting conventional evidence. Judge Nilsen's expression hardened. Ms. Olsen, this court requires evidence, not conspiracy theories about classified operations. Unless you can provide concrete proof of these alleged authorizations, we'll proceed on the assumption that your client violated clearly established aviation laws. Throughout this exchange, Astrid remained silent. She had not spoken a single word since her arrest 3 weeks earlier. Medical evaluation suggested selective mutism, possibly triggered by combat trauma, but she had refused all psychological assessments. The only communication she had made was through brief written notes to her attorney, always in Norwegian, always requesting that Bjørn be allowed to remain with her. The dog wore an official service animal vest, though its provenance was as mysterious as everything else about Astrid Haugen. As Prosecutor Andersen prepared to call his first witness, something almost imperceptible occurred. Astrid's right hand, still resting on Bjørn's fur, moved in a subtle pattern. 3 gentle taps, followed by a slight pressure change. The dog's ears perked slightly, but he maintained his relaxed position. In the gallery, retired NATO Colonel Henrik Frost noticed the interaction. As former liaison to Arctic Command, he had attended the trial out of curiosity about the defendant's claims. But that small hand movement triggered a memory that made him sit forward with sudden attention. The state calls Lieutenant Colonel Magnus Eriksson, Andersen announced with satisfaction. A distinguished man in his 50s approached the witness stand, wearing his Norwegian Air Force dress uniform. As commanding officer of the 330 Squadron, based at Bodo Air Station, Eriksson was responsible for monitoring all aircraft activity in the Arctic regions. Colonel Eriksson, Anderson began, are you familiar with the defendant's claimed rescue operations in Svalbard airspace? I am aware of the claims, Eriksson replied carefully. However, I can state definitively that no such operations were authorized through my command or any other Norwegian military authority I'm aware of. And what about these alleged NATO emergency protocols she claims to have been operating under? Eriksson's expression grew stern. NATO Article 5 does provide for emergency response measures, but any such operations would require coordination with national commands. No such coordination occurred regarding Ms. Haugen's flights. Anderson smiled triumphantly. So, in your professional opinion, the defendant was operating illegally in restricted airspace? Based on the information available to me, yes. During cross-examination, Maria Olsen struggled to make headway. Colonel, are there circumstances where emergency operations might be conducted without standard coordination? In extreme emergencies, yes, but such actions would be reported immediately afterward. No such reports were filed. What if the operations were classified above your clearance level? Anderson objected before Eriksson could answer. Speculation, Your Honor. Sustained, Judge Nilsson ruled. Ms. Olsen, unless you have evidence of these supposed classified operations, please confine yourself to established facts. As the morning progressed, witness after witness testified to Astrid's apparent violations. Air traffic controllers described her helicopter appearing on radar without authorization, ignoring all radio communications. Weather service personnel confirmed that she had flown in conditions that grounded all other aircraft. Through it all, Astrid remained silent, her hand occasionally making those subtle movements on Bjørn's fur. The dog's responses were equally subtle, slight ear movements, barely perceptible shifts in attention, changes in breathing pattern that only someone trained to read working dogs would notice. Colonel Frost, still watching from the gallery, became increasingly convinced that he was witnessing something significant. The hand movements were too precise, too purposeful to be mere nervous gestures. And the dog's responses suggested training far beyond standard service animal protocols. During the lunch recess, Frost approached Maria Olsen in the hallway. Ms. Olsen, I'm Colonel Henrik Frost, retired NATO Arctic Command. I believe there may be more to your client's story than appears in the official records. Maria looked up hopefully. Do you have information about her service record? Not directly, but I recognize certain indicators. Would it be possible to speak with Captain Haugen privately? She doesn't speak, Colonel. She hasn't said a word since her arrest. Frost nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps she doesn't need to speak for us to understand who she is. When court resumed, Prosecutor Anderson called his final witness of the day, Dr. Sarah Johansson, a psychiatrist who had attempted to evaluate Astrid. Dr. Johansson, what was your assessment of the defendant's mental state? Ms. Haugen presents with what appears to be selective mutism, likely trauma-induced. She shows classic signs of someone who has constructed an elaborate fantasy to cope with unspecified psychological damage. And these fantasies about Arctic rescue operations? Consistent with what we see in individuals who seek to reimagine themselves as heroes. The detailed nature of her claims suggests considerable time spent developing these scenarios. In your professional opinion, is she fit to stand trial? She understands the proceedings and can assist in her defense through written communication. However, her persistent refusal to acknowledge reality regarding her alleged military service is concerning. As Dr. Johansson spoke, something changed in Astrid's demeanor. Her shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, and her pale eyes focused with laser intensity on the psychiatrist. During cross-examination, Maria asked, Dr. Johansson, are you familiar with the psychological profiles of actual special operations personnel? Generally, yes. And would such personnel be trained to maintain operational silence even under extreme stress? I suppose that's possible, but would they also be trained to maintain cover stories that appear fictional to protect classified operations? Anderson objected, but Judge Nilsson allowed the question. Theoretically, yes, but this is pure speculation regarding Ms. Haugen's actual background. As Dr. Johansson left the stand, Colonel Frost made a decision. He stood and approached the bailiff. Your Honor, I request permission to address the court. I have information relevant to these proceedings. Judge Nilsson looked annoyed. Colonel, this is highly irregular. Are you an expert witness? I am Colonel Henrik Frost, retired NATO Arctic Command. I believe I can provide context for what we've been witnessing. After a brief consultation with both attorneys, Judge Nilsson allowed Frost to take the stand. Colonel Frost, what information do you wish to provide? Your Honor, I've been observing the defendant's behavior throughout today's proceedings. Specifically, her interactions with her service animal display patterns consistent with classified military working dog protocols. A murmur of interest rippled through the courtroom. For the first time since the trial began, Astrid's eyes focused completely on the proceedings. What kind of protocols? Judge Nilsson asked. Tactical communication systems used by certain special operations units. The hand movements I've observed are too precise and purposeful to be coincidental. Prosecutor Anderson scoffed. Your Honor, the Colonel is asking us to believe that subtle pet interactions constitute evidence of military service. Actually, Frost continued, I'm suggesting that we're seeing operational behavior that would be impossible to fake or learn outside specific training programs. Judge Nilsson studied Astrid with new interest. Colonel, are you prepared to demonstrate what you mean? That would be up to Captain Haugen, Your Honor. The protocols I'm referring to are classified, and only someone with legitimate training would know the appropriate responses. All eyes turned to Astrid, who remained motionless for several long seconds. Then, slowly, she reached into her jacket pocket and removed a small object, a weathered military challenge coin bearing the insignia of Arctic Command. She placed it on the table in front of her, the metallic clink echoing in the silent courtroom. Judge Nilsson leaned forward. Ms. Haugen, are you prepared to participate in Colonel Frost's suggested demonstration? Astrid looked directly at the judge for the first time, her pale blue eyes holding steady. She nodded once, a precise military acknowledgement. Very well. Colonel Frost, please explain what we should observe. Your Honor, Arctic working dogs receive specialized training for extreme environment operations. Their handlers use communication protocols that combine elements of traditional sled dog commands, Sami reindeer herding signals, and tactical military procedures. Frost turned to address the courtroom. These protocols are classified because they're used in sensitive border operations. A handler who learned these techniques in civilian settings would be impossible. The training occurs only within specific NATO Arctic units. Prosecutor Anderson stood to object, but Judge Nilsson held up a hand. I'll allow this demonstration, but if it proves to be theatrical nonsense, I'll hold both the Colonel and Defense Counsel in contempt. Maria Olsen nodded nervously. Your Honor, my client accepts responsibility for the demonstration. Astrid remained seated, but her posture had transformed. Gone was the hunched defensiveness of a confused defendant. In its place sat the controlled alertness of a professional soldier. She looked down at Bjørn, who had been lying peacefully throughout the proceedings. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition, an activation of protocols long dormant. Without speaking, Astrid made a series of hand gestures. Starting with her right hand, she formed what appeared to be the shape of mountains, followed by a circular motion, then 3 quick downward movements. Bjørn's transformation was immediate and startling. The relaxed service dog disappeared, replaced by a tactical asset in full operational mode. He rose to a precise standing position, weight distributed evenly, head level, eyes scanning the courtroom in a systematic pattern. My God, whispered someone in the gallery. Astrid continued the demonstration with a barely audible whistle, not the casual sound one might make to call a pet, but a complex pattern of tones that seemed to speak directly to the dog's training. Bjørn responded by executing a movement sequence that no civilian animal could have learned. He positioned himself to create optimal sight lines to all courtroom entrances, his head turning at precise intervals in what military personnel would recognize as a threat assessment pattern. Colonel Frost spoke quietly to the mesmerized courtroom. What you're witnessing is a defensive perimeter protocol. The dog is systematically evaluating potential threat vectors and positioning himself to provide maximum early warning capability. This is impossible, Dr. Johansson murmured from the gallery. Service dogs aren't trained for tactical applications. Astrid heard the comment. For the first time since her arrest, she opened her mouth to speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the courtroom, every word carried clearly. Bjørn isn't a service dog, she said in accented English, her Norwegian origins evident. He's my flight crew. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Judge Nilsson called for order, but his own expression showed the shock of everyone present. Ms. Haugen, he said carefully, you've chosen to break your silence. Are you prepared to answer questions about these proceedings? Astrid nodded, her hand moving to rest on Bjørn's head. The dog had returned to a relaxed position, but his alertness remained heightened. Your Honor, she began, her voice gaining strength, my name is Captain Astrid Haugen, Norwegian Air Force, seconded to NATO Arctic Command. My service record appears incomplete because my unit operates under special access programs. Prosecutor Anderson jumped to his feet. Your Honor, we've seen no evidence supporting these claims. Military records show only basic flight training. That's correct, Astrid replied calmly. Our operational records are maintained separately from standard personnel files. For obvious security reasons. Colonel Frost requested permission to continue his questioning. Captain Haugen, can you describe the nature of your Arctic operations? Astrid was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. I was, the primary search and rescue pilot for NATO's Arctic Response Team. My area of operations covers everything north of the 70th parallel, including Svalbard, Franz Josef Land, and the polar approaches to Russian airspace. And the missions you've been accused of conducting illegally? Emergency extractions of NATO personnel from aircraft that went down in Arctic conditions. Weather or equipment failures that occurred during classified reconnaissance flights. She paused, her eyes taking on a distant quality. In the past 5 years, I've performed 47 extraction missions. The operations I'm being prosecuted for represent 6 of those missions. 47, Judge Nilsson repeated slowly. That's an extraordinary number. The Arctic doesn't forgive mistakes, Your Honor. When military aircraft operate at the edge of what's possible, sometimes they don't make it home. When that happens, someone has to go get them. Maria Olsen finally found her voice. Captain, why didn't you present this information during your arrest and initial hearings? Astrid's expression hardened slightly. Because acknowledging these operations in open court compromises ongoing NATO surveillance activities. Russian intelligence monitors Norwegian legal proceedings. Every word spoken here will be analyzed by their military intelligence services. The implications of this statement hit the courtroom like a physical force. If Astrid was telling the truth, then this public trial was exposing classified NATO operations to hostile scrutiny. Prosecutor Anderson, sensing his case collapsing, tried a different approach. Even if we accept these claims, operating without proper authorization is still illegal. I operate under standing orders from Arctic Command, Astrid replied. Those orders authorize immediate response to NATO personnel in distress, regardless of jurisdictional boundaries. Then why can't these orders be produced? Colonel Frost interjected. Because doing so would reveal operational capabilities and response times to anyone monitoring these proceedings. Including adversaries. Judge Nilsson looked deeply troubled. This court is faced with an impossible situation. If the defendant's claims are true, continuing this trial publicly compromises national security. If they're false, she's perpetrating an elaborate deception. Astrid reached into her jacket again, this time removing a small device that looked like a standard military radio, but smaller and more sophisticated. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I can request verification of my status through encrypted channels. Absolutely not, Anderson protested. This could be any piece of electronic equipment. For all we know, she's calling her accomplices to support her story. Colonel Frost examined the device from a distance. Your Honor, that appears to be a Sinker's tactical radio, specifically configured for NATO encrypted communications. Civilian access to such equipment would be impossible. Astrid activated the device, and the courtroom filled with the distinctive sound of encrypted military communications, bursts of digital static punctuated by brief voice transmissions in multiple languages. She spoke into the radio in Norwegian, providing what sounded like identification codes and position coordinates. After several minutes of back-and-forth communication, she set the device aside. Arctic Command confirms my operational status, she announced. They're also requesting that this court suspend proceedings pending national security review. As the courtroom buzzed with uncertainty about how to proceed, Astrid made an unexpected decision. She stood, Bjørn immediately moving to heel position, and addressed Judge Nilsen directly. Your Honor, before any decisions are made about these proceedings, I believe this court should understand what my team and I actually do in the Arctic. She gestured toward the large windows overlooking Oslo. Most people see the Arctic as empty wilderness. They don't understand that it's actually one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. Climate change is opening new shipping routes and resource extraction opportunities. Every major power is positioning for control. Judge Nilsen, clearly fascinated despite the irregularity of the situation, allowed her to continue. 3 months ago, a Norwegian intelligence aircraft experienced engine failure during a reconnaissance flight near the Russian border. The crew had approximately 12 minutes to reach international waters before Russian interceptors arrived. She moved to the courtroom's map display, pointing to the Svalbard archipelago. The aircraft went down here, in pack ice approximately 40 nautical miles from the nearest possible landing site. Rescue by conventional means would take 6 hours minimum. The crew would be dead from exposure in 2. So you responded without authorization? Anderson asked, trying to regain control of his case. I responded understanding NATO emergency protocols. Bjørn and I launched within 8 minutes of receiving the distress call. Her voice took on the professional tone of a mission briefing. Weather conditions were severe, winds gusting to 70 knots, visibility near zero, air temperature minus 38 degrees Celsius. Standard helicopters cannot operate in such conditions. But you could? Judge Nilsen asked. My aircraft is specially modified for Arctic operations. Enhanced heating systems, ice protection, navigation equipment rated for polar magnetic variation. More importantly, Bjørn and I train constantly for these exact scenarios. She looked down at the Husky, who was watching her with intelligent attention. In Arctic rescue operations, the dog isn't just along for company. He's trained to locate survivors by scent even in blizzard conditions, to assist with medical stabilization, and to provide thermal support during evacuation. Colonel Frost nodded approvingly. The protocol Captain Haugen demonstrated earlier, that's how handlers communicate with Arctic working dogs during operations. Voice commands are often impossible due to wind and engine noise. Astrid continued her account. We found the crew 23 minutes after receiving their distress call. The pilot had suffered a concussion during the crash landing, and the intelligence officer had a compound fracture of his left leg. Both were showing early signs of hypothermia. How did you extract them? Maria asked, completely absorbed in the story. Single ship extraction in those conditions requires precise coordination. Bjørn located the survivors and established a thermal perimeter while I positioned the aircraft. The injured officer had to be carried to the helicopter, which meant leaving the aircraft unmanned in 60-knot winds. She paused, her eyes reflecting the memory of that mission. Bjørn maintained visual contact with both the survivors and the aircraft while I performed the medical stabilization. Without his positioning and alerting, we would have lost them. And the Russian interceptors? Judge Nilsen asked quietly. We crossed into international airspace with approximately 90 seconds to spare. Russian jets shadowed us for another 40 minutes, but they couldn't legally interfere once we were in neutral waters. Prosecutor Anderson, looking increasingly desperate, tried one more attack. This is all very dramatic, but we still have no verification of any of these claims. Astrid smiled for the first time since the trial began. Actually, we do. She nodded toward the courtroom doors, where a figure in NATO dress uniform had just entered. The man approached with military bearing, his insignia identifying him as a high-ranking officer. Your Honor, the newcomer announced, I am Brigadier General James Mitchell, NATO Arctic Command. I apologize for the interruption, but this court is discussing classified operations. The arrival of General Mitchell transformed the atmosphere in the courtroom completely. Even Judge Nilsson stood respectfully as the NATO officer approached the bench. General, the judge said carefully, this court is conducting legal proceedings under Norwegian law. While we respect your position, we cannot simply suspend a trial without proper authority. I understand completely, Your Honor. I'm not here to interfere with Norwegian sovereignty. I'm here to provide official clarification about Captain Haugen's status and service record. General Mitchell turned to address the full courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've been witnessing today is not a criminal defendant making false claims about military service. Captain Astrid Haugen is one of the most decorated rescue pilots in NATO Arctic Command. He removed a folder from his briefcase and handed it to Judge Nilsson. These are her official service commendations, declassified specifically for these proceedings. Captain Haugen has been awarded the NATO Meritorious Service Medal 3 times, the Norwegian Air Force Distinguished Flying Cross, and the International Arctic Council's highest honor for life-saving operations. Prosecutor Anderson looked stunned. General, why weren't these records available during our investigation? Because Captain Haugen's unit operates under special access protocols. Her missions often involve intelligence gathering in sensitive border regions. Full disclosure of her activities could compromise ongoing operations and endanger other personnel. The general walked over to where Astrid stood with Bjørn. Captain, permission to address the court about your service record? Astrid nodded. Permission granted, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, in her 5 years with Arctic Command, Captain Haugen has conducted more high-risk rescue operations than any pilot in NATO history. She operates alone, in conditions that ground entire air forces, using equipment and techniques that exist nowhere else in the world. He gestured toward Bjørn. Her partnership with specialized Arctic working dogs represents a unique capability. There are only 3 pilot dog teams currently operational in the entire NATO alliance. Captain Haugen's team has the highest success rate and operates in the most dangerous conditions. Judge Nilsson studied the documents carefully. General, these commendations are impressive, but they don't specifically address the allegations in this case. The defendant is accused of unauthorized flights in restricted airspace. Your Honor, every flight Captain Haugen conducted was authorized under NATO emergency response protocols. The confusion arose because these authorizations are processed through classified channels that don't interface with civilian air traffic control systems. General Mitchell activated a tablet device and projected an image onto the courtroom's display screen. This is real-time satellite imagery of Arctic Command Operations Center. With the court's permission, I'll establish a secure communication link to verify Captain Haugen's mission status. Within minutes, the courtroom was connected to a high-tech command center where uniformed personnel monitored screens showing weather patterns, aircraft positions, and communication feeds from across the Arctic region. A voice came through the speakers with crystal clarity, Oslo courthouse, this is Arctic Command duty officer. We show Captain Haugen as active operational status, currently assigned to emergency response standby. Request immediate release for potential mission deployment. The timing was perfect, as if orchestrated to prove Astrid's claims. An alarm began sounding in the background of the transmission. Arctic Command, Oslo courthouse here, General Mitchell responded. What's your situation? We have a distress call from a research vessel trapped in pack ice approximately 200 nautical miles northeast of Svalbard. Norwegian Coast Guard assets are weathered in. Captain Haugen and her team are our only available rescue capability. Every person in the courtroom understood the implications. While they had been debating Astrid's legitimacy, real people in real danger needed exactly the skills she claimed to possess. Judge Nilsson faced an unprecedented situation. Before him stood a defendant whose alleged crimes were actually life-saving missions conducted under legitimate military authority. More importantly, those same skills were needed immediately to save lives. This court is prepared to dismiss all charges against Captain Haugen, he announced after a brief recess for consultation. However, I want to address the larger issues this case has raised. He looked directly at Astrid. Captain, your service to NATO and to humanity is clearly exemplary. The missions you've conducted represent the highest traditions of military service and international cooperation. Then he turned to Prosecutor Anderson. Mr. Anderson, this case demonstrates the importance of thorough investigation before bringing charges against military personnel. The defendant's silence wasn't obstruction, it was operational security. Your Honor, Anderson said quietly, I had no way to know. You had every opportunity to coordinate with military authorities before pursuing prosecution, Judge Nilsson replied firmly. This trial has potentially compromised ongoing operations and wasted valuable court resources. General Mitchell stepped forward. Your Honor, if the court is prepared to release Captain Haugen, we have an immediate operational requirement. Astrid was already moving toward the door, Bjørn at perfect heel position. The transformation from defendant to operational pilot was instantaneous. Captain, Judge Nilsson called out. Before you go, is there anything you'd like to say to this court? Astrid paused, considering her words carefully. Your Honor, most of what my team and I do happens in places where no one can see us, in conditions where mistakes are fatal. We don't expect recognition or public acknowledgement. She looked around the courtroom, her eyes meeting those of the spectators who had spent the day judging her. But we do expect that when we return from those missions, our own legal system will trust that we acted honorably. Today's proceedings suggest that trust may need to be rebuilt. With that, she was gone, General Mitchell and Colonel Frost following. Through the courtroom windows, spectators could see a military convoy arriving to transport them to the airfield. 6 hours later, news reports began broadcasting footage of a dramatic Arctic rescue. A Norwegian research vessel, trapped in shifting pack ice with 14 crew members aboard, had been reached by a lone helicopter operating in impossible weather conditions. The footage showed the aircraft hovering over the ice, its downwash creating whirlwinds of snow. A figure rappelled down from the helicopter, Captain Astrid Haugen, moving with precise efficiency across the treacherous surface. But what captured viewers' attention was the large dog that followed, lowered on its own harness system. Bjørn immediately began working with his handler to establish rescue protocols, locating crew members and assessing their condition. The rescue operation took 4 hours, with multiple trips through worsening weather. Each evacuation required perfect coordination between pilot, dog, and the desperate crew members being saved. International news outlets picked up the story within hours. The Arctic Angel, as she came to be known, became a symbol of quiet heroism and professional excellence. The Oslo courthouse received hundreds of calls and emails about the trial. Many expressed shame at how Captain Haugen had been treated, while others demanded to know more about NATO's Arctic operations. Judge Nilsson gave only one interview about the case. Sometimes our legal system encounters individuals whose service is so far beyond normal experience that we fail to recognize who they really are. Captain Haugen reminded us that heroes don't always look like what we expect. Colonel Frost, when contacted by reporters, provided perhaps the most insightful comment: what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one pilot's legal problems. It was about respecting the people who keep us safe in ways we never see or understand. 3 months after the trial, Captain Astrid Haugen continued her Arctic operations, though new protocols were established to prevent similar legal complications. Her service record was partially declassified, revealing a career of unprecedented courage and skill. The research vessel rescue had been her 48th successful mission. By year's end, she would conduct 6 more, each in conditions that most pilots would consider impossible. But perhaps the most important outcome was the recognition that true service often happens in silence, performed by individuals who seek no recognition and expect no praise. They ask only that when they return from the edge of the world, their dedication is met with the respect it deserves. Bjørn, for his part, received a commendation from the International Working Dog Association, the first Arctic rescue dog to be so honored. He continued to serve as Astrid's partner, guardian, and friend in one of the world's most dangerous operational environments. The Arctic, vast and unforgiving, remained under their protection. And somewhere in those endless white expanses, the quiet heroes continued their work, saving lives that would otherwise be lost to the cold and the dark. Because in the end, that's what heroes do. They serve, they sacrifice, and they ask for nothing in return except the chance to do it again tomorrow. Have you ever encountered someone whose true capabilities were hidden beneath an ordinary appearance? Share your thoughts in the comments below about the importance of recognizing the quiet heroes among us. Subscribe to Silent Legends for more stories of courage that deserves to be remembered.